How would you feel if someone judged you before you even said a word? A quiet cafe, a single phone call, a life-changing lesson on judgment. Marcus walked into the small cafe, the doorbell chiming lightly as he pushed the door open. The cozy atmosphere of the cafe contrasted sharply with the tension he felt building in his chest. He hadn't been to a place like this in a while. Small, tucked away, a haven for locals. He just needed a coffee, a break from his busy day. Dressed in a simple sweater and jeans, Marcus didn't stand out. He wasn't looking for attention, just the warmth of the coffee and the quiet hum of a place where no one would bother him. But today, that wouldn't be the case. Behind the counter, Sarah's eyes were fixed on Marcus as he walked in. Something about him made her uneasy. She could feel a strange tightening in her chest. It was irrational. She knew it was irrational. But the discomfort gnawed at her nonetheless. The cafe wasn't busy. Just a few other patrons in the corner, deep in conversation or buried in their laptops. Still, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling. She had worked here long enough to know who belonged, and Marcus, for some reason, didn't feel like he fit in. Her fingers brushed nervously against the edge of the counter, the register now feeling like something heavier than it ever had before. She watched as Marcus approached the counter and ordered a simple coffee. He smiled politely, but Sarah's mind couldn't stop racing. She forced a smile, trying to push away the gnawing discomfort. She took his money, keeping her movements steady, her mind distracted by the irrational worry that had no real explanation. Then, as he stepped away from the counter, the tension in Sarah's stomach surged. Her heart beat a little faster as she watched him take a seat by the window, alone. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He wasn't behaving strangely. But in that moment, all Sarah could see was his presence, and something inside her whispered that something wasn't right. She glanced around, the small cafe feeling more crowded than it actually was. Her eyes landed on the phone beside the register. Just for a moment, she hesitated. But then, a voice inside her, the voice of unspoken fears and hidden biases, urged her to act. She needed to do something. Without thinking, Sarah picked up the phone and dialed 911. She spoke quickly, her words coming out in a rush. "There's a man here. I'm not sure, but something's not right. He's acting strange." Her voice trembled as she spoke, the fear in her chest mixing with a confusion she couldn't explain. She didn't know why she was calling. She didn't know why he made her feel this way. But in that moment, the fear overpowered her better judgment. "Okay," the dispatcher said calmly. "We'll send someone over." She hung up the phone, her pulse racing. She glanced toward Marcus, still sitting by the window, oblivious to what had just happened. The cafe seemed quieter now, the air thick with tension. Marcus wasn't aware of it, but he was the subject of a call that would change everything. Sarah moved away from the counter, her hands shaking slightly, but there was nothing to do now. She couldn't take back the call. She couldn't undo the fear that had driven her to dial the police. Marcus, meanwhile, sat in his seat, looking out the window, lost in thought, completely unaware of the storm that was brewing around him. He had come here for peace, for a moment of quiet in his hectic life. Little did he know, his life was about to change in ways he couldn't have anticipated. As the minutes passed, the hum of the cafe felt different. Sarah couldn't stop watching Marcus. She had no idea what was coming next, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to unfold that neither of them would ever forget. "Where are you watching from, and what time is it? Drop a comment below." The police arrived within minutes, sirens echoing down the empty street as 2 officers stepped inside the cafe. The bell above the door chimed as they walked in, their boots heavy against the floor. Marcus looked up from his coffee, his brow furrowed, his calm expression still as the officers moved toward him. The energy in the room shifted, palpable now, as the officer's presence filled the space with an uncomfortable tension. Officer Reynolds spoke first, his voice clipped and authoritative. "Sir, we got a call about a suspicious individual. We need to see some ID." Marcus blinked in confusion, his eyes momentarily meeting the officer's. His grip on his coffee cup tightened slightly, but he kept his voice steady, refusing to let the rush of uncertainty show. "Suspicious?" he repeated, the word feeling foreign, a label that didn't fit. He hadn't done anything wrong. Yet here they were, standing over him, scrutinizing him like a suspect. The tension in the cafe thickened. Every set of eyes seemed to follow the officer's every movement, but Marcus stayed still, his composure unwavering. The noise in the cafe faded, and all he could hear was the thudding of his own heartbeat. Sarah, still behind the counter, felt her stomach churn. She hadn't expected things to escalate this far. The 911 call had been impulsive, her mind clouded by a fear she hadn't fully understood. Now, as the officer stepped closer, she couldn't help but feel like she had made a terrible mistake. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she could hardly bring herself to look at Marcus. But it was too late to undo her decision. The situation was spiraling, and all she could do was watch. Marcus, his face calm but his thoughts racing, slowly reached for his wallet. His hands were steady, slow, deliberate. He had been here before. He knew how this went. It didn't matter that he hadn't done anything wrong. It didn't matter that he was just trying to enjoy a quiet coffee in a cafe. What mattered was that, in their eyes, he wasn't someone they could trust. In their eyes, he was a threat, simply because of the color of his skin. He held out his ID, his fingers wrapping around the card with a quiet determination, feeling the weight of the moment. His calmness was not a sign of indifference. It was a shield, a practiced control over the anger that bubbled just beneath the surface. He'd had to build this armor over the years. It was the only way to survive situations like these. The officers took his ID without a word, studying it carefully. Their eyes flicked between the card and his face, their judgment evident in their silence. The minutes dragged on, each second stretched taut, as if time itself was holding its breath. They didn't recognize his name. They didn't know who he was, nor did they seem to care. Finally, one of the officers grunted, muttering, "Just try to keep a low profile." With that, the two of them turned and walked away without so much as an apology. No acknowledgement of their mistake. No recognition of the injustice that had just occurred. Just the weight of their assumptions settling like a dark cloud in the room. Sarah watched as the officers moved toward the door. Her fingers trembled around the counter. She couldn't meet Marcus's gaze. She couldn't find the words to apologize, even if she wanted to. She hadn't meant for any of this to happen. But the damage was done. Marcus sat there for a moment, his hand still resting on the table. He didn't speak, didn't move. He wasn't angry, not yet. He had learned to take the slights in silence. But tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, he wouldn't be silent anymore. As the officers exited the cafe, Marcus exhaled slowly, his breath shaky but controlled. He finally met Sarah's gaze, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes, an unspoken truth. He didn't need to say a word. It was in the way he held his gaze, unflinching, even after everything that had just happened. Sarah felt a pang of guilt. A small part of her wanted to apologize, to explain that she hadn't meant to make things worse, but the words stuck in her throat. She knew it wasn't enough. The damage had been done. In the silence that followed, the cafe slowly began to return to its usual rhythm, but the moment was still hanging in the air. Marcus had been wrongly judged, falsely accused, and now he was left to carry that weight. But he wouldn't let it break him. Not this time. Have you ever experienced discrimination firsthand? Share your story below. The cafe door swung open with a soft chime, and this time Marcus walked in with a presence that immediately commanded attention. Gone was the casual sweater from yesterday. Today, he wore a tailored suit that fit him perfectly, exuding confidence and power. The transformation was stark, and it was clear from the way the customers looked up, whispering amongst themselves, that they noticed too. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she saw him enter. Her stomach tightened and her hands trembled as she reached for the coffee pot. She hadn't expected to see him again, and certainly not like this. Yesterday, he had been just another customer, someone she thought she could dismiss. But today, he was a completely different person, a person whose identity she hadn't even scratched the surface of. Marcus walked confidently to the counter, his gaze steady as he approached Sarah. She couldn't look him in the eye, still haunted by the events of the day before, but she managed a shaky greeting. "Hello, what can I get for you today?" His voice was calm but firm, and it sent a chill down her spine. "Good morning, Sarah. I'd like a coffee to go, please." Sarah's mind raced, her thoughts scrambling. She fumbled with the coffee machine, barely hearing him as she tried to process what was happening. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected to see him standing there again, much less in a suit like that. She wanted to apologize, to explain that she hadn't meant for any of this to happen, but the words wouldn't come. Just as she poured the coffee, Marcus reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a business card. He placed it gently on the counter in front of her, his fingers brushing against hers. Sarah's eyes fell to the card. She glanced at the name printed there, and her breath caught in her throat. Marcus Foster, FBI Director. The words seemed to blur as she read them again. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The man she had judged yesterday, the man she had called the police on, was one of the most powerful figures in the country. Her mind raced. The mistake she had made. The wrong assumption. She could feel the heat rise in her face, her shame burning through her veins. The truth of what she had done, the unjust call she had made, was sinking in, and she could hardly bear to face him. Marcus stood there, unbothered by her discomfort, watching her as she processed the truth. He said nothing, but the weight of his presence was heavy in the air between them. Sarah's voice shook as she managed to speak. I'm sorry," she stammered, her words tumbling out. "I didn't know who you were. I didn't mean to." Marcus held up a hand, stopping her before she could finish. "It's not about what you meant, Sarah. It's about what you assumed. The judgment you passed without knowing anything about me." She swallowed hard, feeling the sting of his words. She wanted to apologize, to explain that it was an impulse, that she had been afraid and confused, but she couldn't find the right words. Her entire perception of him had been shattered in that moment. The man she had feared was someone with the power to change her life. And yet here he was, standing before her, calm and composed. The silence in the cafe was deafening as Sarah stood there, unable to look Marcus in the eye. Her face burned with shame. The words she had wanted to say, an apology, an explanation, anything to make this better, seemed to catch in her throat. She had acted on impulse, based on fear and prejudice, and now she had to face the consequences of her own ignorance. I didn't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Marcus nodded, his gaze calm but intense. He didn't seem angry, but his words carried the weight of the truth. "That's the problem, Sarah," he said, his voice firm but measured. "You didn't know, but you assumed." The entire cafe had fallen silent, every eye fixed on them. The tension in the air was palpable, as if everyone understood that this moment wasn't just about Sarah and Marcus. It was about the judgments we make every day, often without thinking, the assumptions we hold on to without question. Marcus let the silence stretch, letting his words sink in before he spoke again. "Yesterday, I was just a black man in your eyes. Nothing more. And because of that, you thought I was dangerous." Sarah swallowed hard, her mind racing. She had assumed, and in doing so she had treated Marcus like a threat without ever truly seeing him. She had seen the skin, the appearance, but not the person. And she had made a mistake, a costly mistake. The weight of Marcus's words settled over her like a heavy blanket. Her throat tightened as she tried to find the right words to say. But there was nothing she could say that could undo what had already been done. Marcus wasn't done yet. He didn't raise his voice, but his words cut through the air like a knife. "You didn't take the time to know me, Sarah. You didn't stop to ask yourself, who is this person? Instead, you assumed I was dangerous because of how I looked. You assumed that I didn't belong here, that I didn't deserve respect. That's what happens when you judge someone without knowing them." Sarah's heart sank as she processed his words. The truth was undeniable, and she had seen it happen all too often. The news was filled with stories of people like her, people who let their biases dictate how they saw others. She had become one of those people, and the realization hit her harder than she expected. Her assumptions had nearly led to a tragedy. It wasn't just about Marcus. It was about the countless others who had been treated unfairly, simply because of their appearance. She looked up at Marcus, her eyes filled with regret. She had allowed herself to fall into the trap of judging someone based on their race, and in doing so, she had disrespected him, dehumanized him. The moment hung in the air, and for a brief second, Sarah wondered how she could make it right. But she knew the damage was done. All she could do was learn from it. Marcus took a step back, his expression softening slightly. "I'm not angry with you, Sarah," he said quietly, "but you need to remember this. It's not just about who you think you know. It's about who you're willing to understand." Sarah nodded, her eyes now filled with tears. She had learned a lesson, a painful one. But it was a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life. A lesson about judgment, about assumptions, and about the harm they could do. The cafe was still quiet, but the silence felt different now. It was a silence filled with reflection, with an understanding that perhaps everyone in the room had been guilty of judging someone without really seeing them. She took a deep breath, ready to acknowledge the impact of her actions. But most of all, she knew she had to change, and maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to make a difference. Has this story changed the way you see others? Let's talk about it in the comments. The room was silent as Marcus took a slow sip of his coffee. The bitter taste, somehow, didn't compare to the sharpness of the lesson he had just delivered. His eyes lingered on Sarah for a moment, and as he placed the cup down, he let out a steady breath. "I hope you remember this moment," he said, his voice calm but firm, "because next time, someone might not be as patient as I was." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had expected him to berate her more, to lecture her further. But instead, his words felt like a weight, a reminder of the opportunity she had been given, an opportunity she almost squandered. For the first time, she felt the gravity of what she had done and how much it had cost her. Marcus stood up, his tall figure casting a long shadow over the room. With one final glance, he turned and walked toward the door. The sound of his footsteps was the only thing that broke the silence, each step marking the end of the confrontation. As the door swung open, he left, and just like that, the cafe seemed to exhale collectively, as if everyone in the room had been holding their breath, waiting for the moment to pass. Sarah was frozen. She stared at the door where he had just exited, the weight of his words lingering in the air, like an unfinished sentence. The entire room felt smaller now, and for the first time she was completely aware of the impact of her actions. She had assumed, and in doing so she had disrespected someone who had only tried to help. It wasn't just about Marcus. It was about every person she had ever judged, every person who had ever been labeled unfairly because of something as simple as appearance. Her mind raced, but the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. She had been given a second chance, a chance to recognize her mistake, to learn, and to change. But as the seconds ticked by, she wondered if it was too late. Would Marcus ever forgive her? Would anyone ever see her the same way again? The hum of conversation slowly returned to the cafe, but it felt distant. She could hear people discussing the scene, some speaking in hushed tones, others speaking louder, trying to make sense of what had just occurred. But it all seemed irrelevant to Sarah. Nothing mattered but the weight of what Marcus had said, and the understanding that came with it. She felt the sting of shame, but it wasn't just about her mistake. It was about the realization that this kind of judgment was all too common. She had done it before, and so had others. The difference was that Marcus had confronted her with the truth, and now she couldn't ignore it. The power of assumption, the danger of prejudice. It was all too clear now, and she knew that, from this point forward, she couldn't let herself fall into that trap again. She glanced around the cafe, the familiar surroundings suddenly feeling foreign. There was no one to turn to for comfort, no quick way to make this right. But she knew, deep down, that the only way to atone for her actions was to change her mindset, her perspective, and, most importantly, to recognize the value in everyone, regardless of who they were or where they came from. As the last of the conversations died down, Sarah made a decision. She would remember this moment. She would make it a part of who she was. She would carry the lesson Marcus had taught her, and she would pass it on, hoping to make a small difference in a world that needed so much more understanding. And as she stood there, feeling the weight of everything that had just transpired, she whispered to herself, "Next time, I'll do better." What would you say to Sarah in this moment? Let us know. This isn't just a story, it's reality. How many times have people been judged for their skin before their character? How many times has a simple assumption led to disaster? These are the questions that linger long after Marcus leaves the cafe, and they're the questions we must all ask ourselves. We live in a world where snap judgments are made daily, where the color of someone's skin or their appearance can determine how they're treated. And Marcus didn't just prove a point about his own experience. He gave Sarah, and everyone watching, a chance to reflect on their own biases. But the real question is, will she change? Sarah's journey doesn't end here. The lesson she learned today is just the beginning. It's one thing to recognize our mistakes. It's another to take that realization and change the way we live. Will she carry forward what Marcus taught her? Will she see everyone for who they truly are, not through the lens of assumptions or stereotypes? Judging someone before you know them doesn't make you right. It makes you blind. When we judge someone based on preconceived notions, we shut ourselves off from the richness of understanding that can come from truly seeing people for who they are. We stop growing, and we stop learning. Marcus showed us that we can do better. We can choose to see each other for who we really are, not based on the color of our skin or the stereotypes we carry. Marcus didn't just change Sarah's day. He might have changed her life. And maybe, just maybe, his actions will inspire others to take a closer look at their own biases and make the world a little more open, understanding, and compassionate. Where are you watching from, and what time is it? Drop a comment below